Hi, welcome back to Storytime. So if you saw my tweet or my little thing on Discord, this is the final Phantom of the Opera Storytime. And then on Sunday, same time as usual, 2 to 4, we're going to be doing a watch-along of the original 1925 silent film starring Lon Chaney of the Phantom of the Opera. And I've been working on how to set that up for the stream. I'm actually going to use this Paris Opera House background, so it'll feel like we are in the Paris Opera House watching the movie. So we'll see what that's like. I've never done a watch-along before. Anyways, we might run a little over, we'll see, but I mean, that's fine with me if it's fine with you. So we'll go ahead and get started. Chapter 21. Vicissitudes of a Persian. The Persian's Narrative. It was the first time that I had entered the house on the lake. I had often begged the trapdoor lover, as we used to call Eric in my country, to open its mysterious doors to me. He always refused. I made many attempts, but in vain, to obtain admittance. Watch him as I might, after I first learnt that he had taken up his permanent abode at the opera, the darkness was always too thick to enable me to see how he worked the door in the wall on the lake. One day, when I thought myself alone, I stepped into the boat and rowed towards that part of the wall through which I had seen Eric disappear. It was then that I came into contact with the siren who guarded the approach, and whose charm was very nearly fatal to me. I had no sooner put off from the bank than the silence amid which I floated on the water was disturbed by a sort of whispering singing that hovered all around me. It was a half-breath, half-music. It rose softly through the waters of the lake, and I was surrounded by it through I knew not what artifice. It followed me, moved with me, and was so soft that it did not alarm me. On the contrary, in my longing to approach the source of that sweet and enticing harmony, I leant out of my little boat over the water, for there was no doubt in my mind but that the singing came from the water itself. By the time I was alone in the boat in the middle of the lake, the voice, for it was now distinctly a voice, was beside me on the water. I leaned over, leaned still further. The lake was perfectly calm, and a moonbeam that passed through the air hole on the Rue Scribe showed me absolutely nothing on the surface, which was smooth and black as ink. I shook my head to get rid of a possible humming in my ear, but I soon had to accept the fact that no humming in the ears could equal, in harmony, the singing whisper that followed and now attracted me. Had I been inclined to superstition, I should certainly have thought that I had to do with some siren whose business it was to confound the traveler rash enough to venture on the waters of the house on the lake. Fortunately, I come from a country where we are too fond of fantastic things not to know them through and through, and I had no doubt but that I was face to face with some new invention of Eric's. But this invention was so perfect that, as I leant out of my boat, I was impelled less by a desire to discover its trick than to enjoy its charm, and I leant out, until I almost overturned the boat. Suddenly, 2 monstrous arms issued from the bosom of the waters and seized me by the neck, dragging me down to the depths with irresistible force. I should certainly have been lost if I had not had time to give a cry by which Eric knew me, for it was he, and instead of drowning me, as was certainly his first intention, he swam with me and laid me gently on the bank. "How imprudent you are," he said, as he stood before me dripping with water. "Why try to enter my house? I did not invite you. I don't want you there, nor anybody. Did you save my life only to make it unbearable to me? However great the service rendered, Eric will perhaps end by forgetting it, and you know that nothing can restrain Eric, not even Eric himself." He spoke, but I had now no other wish than to know what I already called the trick of the siren. He's satisfied my curiosity, for Eric, who is a real monster, I have seen him at work in Persia, alas, is also, in certain respects, a regular child, vain and self-conceited, and there is nothing he loves so much as, after astonishing people, to prove the really miraculous ingenuity of his mind. He laughed and showed me a long reed. "It's the silliest trick you ever saw," he said, "but it's very useful for breathing and singing in the water. I learned it from the Tonkin pirates, who were able to lie hidden for hours at a time in the beds of the rivers." An official report from Tonkin, received in Paris at the end of July 1909, relates how the famous pirate chief, the Detam, was tracked with his men by our soldiers, and how all of them succeeded in escaping, thanks to this trick of the reeds. I spoke to him severely. "It's a trick that nearly killed me," I said, "and it may have been fatal to others. You know what you promised me, Eric. No more murders." "Have I really committed murders?" he asked, putting on his most amiable air. "Wretched man," I cried, "have you forgotten the rosy hours of Mazanderan?" "Yes," he replied in a sadder tone. "I prefer to forget them. I used to make the little sultana laugh, though." "All that belongs to the past," I declared, "but there is the present, and you are responsible to me for the present, because if I had wished, there would have been none at all for you. Remember that, Eric. I saved your life." And I took advantage of the turn in the conversation to speak to him of something that had long been on my mind. "Eric," I asked. "Eric, swear that—" "Swear what?" he retorted. "You know I never keep my oaths. Oaths are made to catch fools with." "Tell me." "You can tell me, at any rate." "Well?" "Well, the chandelier. The chandelier, Eric." "What about the chandelier?" "You know what I mean." "Oh," he sniggered. "I don't mind telling you about the chandelier. It wasn't I. The chandelier was very old and worn." When Eric laughed, he was more terrible than ever. He jumped into the boat, chuckling so horribly that I could not help trembling. "Very old and worn, my dear Daroga. Very old and worn, the chandelier. It fell on of itself. It came down with a smash. And now, Daroga, take my advice and go and dry yourself, or you'll catch a cold in the head. And never get into my boat again, and whatever you do, don't try to enter my house. I'm not always at home, Daroga, and I should be sorry to have to dedicate my requiem mass to you." Daroga is Persian for chief of police. So saying, swaying to and fro like a monkey, and still chuckling, he pushed off and soon disappeared in the darkness of the lake. From that day I gave up all thought of penetrating into his house by way of the lake. The entrance was obviously too well guarded, especially since he had learnt that I knew about it. But I felt that there must be another entrance, for I had often seen Eric disappear in the third cellar while I was watching him, though I could not imagine how. Ever since I discovered Eric installed in the opera, I had lived in a perpetual terror of his horrible fancies. Not in so far as I was concerned, but I dreaded everything for others. The Persian might easily have admitted that Eric's fate also interested himself, for he was well aware that if the government of Teheran had learned that Eric was still alive, it would have been all up with the modest pension of the late Daroga. It is only fair, however, to add that the Persian had a noble and generous heart, and I do not doubt for a moment that the catastrophes which he feared for others greatly occupied his mind. Besides, his conduct throughout his business proves it, and is indeed above all praise. Now I have to find where that was from. And whenever some accident, some fatal event happened, I always thought to myself, I should not be surprised if that were Eric, even as others used to say, "It's the ghost." How often have I not heard people utter that phrase with a smile? Poor devils! If they had known that the ghost existed in the flesh, I swear they would not have laughed. Although Eric announced to me very solemnly that he had altered, and that he had become the most virtuous of men since he was loved for himself, a sentence that at first perplexed me most terribly, I could not help shuddering when I thought of the monster. His horrible, unparalleled, and repulsive ugliness put him without the pale of humanity, and it often seemed to me that, for this reason, he had ceased to believe that he had any duty towards the human race. The way in which he spoke of his love affairs only increased my alarm, for I foresaw the cause of fresh and more hideous tragedies in this event to which he alluded so boastfully. On the other hand, I soon discovered the curious moral traffic established between the monster and Christine Daae. Hidden in the lumber room next to the young prima donna's dressing room, I listened to a wonderful musical display that evidently flung Christine into a marvelous ecstasy. But all the same, I would never have thought that Eric's voice, which was loud as thunder or soft as angels' voices at will, could have made her forget his ugliness. I understood all when I learned that Christine had not yet seen him. I had occasion to go to the dressing room, and remembering the lessons he had once given me, I had no difficulty in discovering the trick that made the wall with the mirrors swing round, and I ascertained the means, of hollow bricks and so on, by which he made his voice carry to Christine as though she heard it close beside her. In this way I also discovered the road that led to the well and the dungeons, the communist dungeons, and also the trap-door that enables Eric to go straight to the cellars below the stage. A few days later, what was not my amazement to learn by my own eyes and ears, that Eric and Christine Daae saw each other, and to catch the monster stooping over the little well in the communist road, and sprinkling the forehead of Christine Daae, who had fainted. A white horse, the horse of the Prophet, which had disappeared from the stables under the opera, was standing quietly beside them. I showed myself. It was terrible. I saw sparks fly from those yellow eyes, and before I had time to say a word, I received a blow on the head that stunned me. When I came to myself again, Eric, Christine, and the white horse had disappeared. I felt sure that the poor girl was a prisoner in the house on the lake. Without hesitation, I resolved to return to the shore, notwithstanding the certain danger. For 24 hours I lay watching for the monster to appear, for I felt that he must go out, driven by the need of obtaining provisions. And in this connection I may say that, when he went out in the streets or ventured to show himself in public, he wore a pasteboard nose, with a mustache attached to it, instead of his own horrible hole of a nose. This did not quite take away his corpse-like aspect, but it made him almost, I say almost, endurable to look at. I therefore watched on the bank of the lake, and weary of long waiting, was beginning to think that he had gone through the other door, the door in the third cellar, when I heard a slight splash in the dark. I saw the two yellow eyes shining like candles, and soon the boat touched shore. Eric jumped out and walked up to me. "You have been here for 24 hours, he said, "and you're annoying me. I tell you all this will end very badly, and you will have brought it upon yourself, for I have been extraordinarily patient with you. You think you are following me, you silly ass. Therefore, it's I whom am following you, and I know all that you know about me here. I spared you yesterday in my communist road, but I warn you, seriously, don't let me catch you there again. Upon my word, you don't seem able to take a hint." He was so furious that I did not think, for the moment, of interrupting him. After puffing and blowing like a walrus, he put his horrible thought into words. "Yes, you must learn once and for all, I say, to take a hint. I tell you that with your recklessness, you have already been twice arrested by the shade in the felt hat, who did not know what you were doing in the cellars, and took you to the managers, who looked upon you as an eccentric Persian interested in stage mechanisms and life behind the scenes. I know all about it. I was there in the office. You know I am everywhere. Well, I tell you what, with your recklessness they will begin to wonder what you are after here, and they will end by knowing that you are after Eric. And they will be after Eric themselves. And if they discover the house on the lake, if they do, it will be a bad lookout for you. Old chap, a bad lookout. I won't answer for anything. Again he puffed and blew like a walrus. I don't answer for anything. If Eric's secrets cease to be Eric's secrets, it will be a bad lookout for a large number of the human race. That's all I had to tell you, and unless you are a sillier ass than I thought, it ought to be enough for you, except that you don't know how to take a hint. He sat down on the stern of his boat and kicked his heels against the plank, waiting to hear what I had to answer. Simply, I said, it's not Eric that I'm after. Who then? You know as well as I do, it's Christine Daae. Enjoy your lurk, Drank. He retorted, I have every right to see her in my house. I am loved by her I am loved for my own sake. That's not true, I said. You have carried her off and are keeping her locked up. Listen, he said. Will you promise never to meddle with my affairs if I prove to you that I am loved for my own sake? Yes, I promise you, I replied without hesitation, for I felt convinced that for such a monster the proof was impossible. Well, then, it's quite simple. Christine Daae shall leave this place as she pleases and come back again. Yes, come back again because she wishes. Come back of herself because she loves me for myself. Ha! I doubt if she will come back, but it is your duty to let her go. My duty, you silly ass. It is my wish to let her go, and she will come back again, for she loves me. All this will end in a marriage at the Madeleine, you silly ass. Do you believe me now? When I tell you that my nuptial mass is written, wait till you hear the Kyrie. He beat time with his heels on the planks of the boat and sang, wait till you hear that mass. Look here, I said. I shall believe you if I see Christine Daae come out of the house on the lake and go back to it of her own accord. And you won't meddle any more in my affairs? No. Very well, you shall see that tonight. Come to the masked ball. Christine and I will go and have a look round. Then you can hide in the lumber room, and you shall see Christine, who will have gone to her dressing room, delighted to come back by the Communist road. And now be off, for I must go and do some shopping. To my intense astonishment, things happened as he had said. Christine Daae left the house on the lake and returned to it several times, without apparently being forced to do so. I then tried to cease thinking about this mysterious love affair, but it was very difficult to me to put Eric out of my mind entirely. However, I resolved to be extremely prudent and did not make the mistake of returning to the shore of the lake or of going by the Communist road, but the idea of the secret entrance in the third cellar haunted me, and I repeatedly went and waited for hours behind a scene from the Roi de Lahore, which had been left there for some reason or other. It was an opera which was not often given. At last my patience was rewarded. One day I saw the monster coming toward me on his knees. I was certain that he could not see me. He passed between the scene behind which I stood and a set-piece, went to the wall, and pressed on a spring that moved a stone and afforded him an ingress. He passed through this, and the stone closed behind him. I waited for at least 30 minutes, and then pressed the spring in my turn. Everything happened as with Eric, but I was careful not to go through the hole myself, for I knew that Eric was inside. On the other hand, the idea that I might be caught by Eric suddenly made me think of the death of Joseph Bouquet. I did not wish to jeopardize the advantages of so great a discovery, which might be useful to many people, to a large number of the human race, in Eric's word, and I left the cellars of the opera after carefully replacing the stone. I continued to be greatly interested in the relations between Eric and Christine Daae, not from my morbid curiosity, but because of the terrible thought which obsessed my mind that Eric was capable of anything, if he once discovered that he was not loved for his own sake, as he imagined. I continued to wander very cautiously about the opera and soon learnt the truth about the monster's dreary love affair. He filled Christine's mind through the terror with which he inspired her, but the dear child's heart belonged wholly to the Vicomte de Chagny. While they played about like an innocent engaged couple keeping to the upper floors of the opera to avoid the monster, they little suspected that someone was watching over their safety. I was prepared to go to all lengths to kill the monster if necessary, and explain to the police afterwards, but Eric did not show himself, and I felt none the more comfortable for this. I must state my whole plan. I thought that the monster, being driven from his home by jealousy, would thus enable me to enter it without danger through the passage in the third cellar. It was important for everybody's sake that I should know exactly what was inside. One day, tired of waiting for an opportunity, I moved the stone and at once heard an astounding music. The monster was working at his Don Juan triumphant, with every door in his house wide open. I knew that this was the work of his life. I was careful not to stir and remained prudently in my dark hole. He stopped playing for a moment and began walking about his place like a madman, and he said aloud at the top of his voice, "I must be finished first! Quite finished!" This speech was not calculated to reassure me, and when the music recommenced, I closed the stone very softly. On the day of the abduction of Christine Daae, I did not come to the theater until rather late in the evening, trembling lest I should hear bad news. I had spent a horrible day, for after reading in a morning paper the announcement of a forthcoming marriage between Christine and the Vicomte de Chagny, I wondered whether, after all, I should not do better to denounce the monster. But my common sense returned to me and soon showed me that any such action could only precipitate the possible catastrophe. When my cab put me down before the opera, I was really almost astonished to see it still standing. But I am something of a fatalist, like all good Orientals, and I entered ready for anything. Christine Daae's abduction in the prison act, which naturally surprised everybody, found me prepared. I was quite certain that she had been juggled away by Eric, that prince of conjurers, and I thought positively that this was the end of Christine and perhaps of everybody, so much so that I thought of advising all those people who were staying on at the theater to make good their escape. I felt, however, that they would be sure to look upon me as mad, and I refrained. On the other hand, I resolved personally to act without further delay. The chances were in my favor that Eric, at that moment, was thinking only of his captive. This was the moment to enter the house through the third cellar, and I resolved to take with me that poor little desperate Vicomte, who, at the first suggestion, accepted with an amount of confidence in myself that touched me profoundly. I had sent my servant for my pistols. I gave one to the Vicomte, and advised him to hold himself ready to fire, for, after all, Eric might be waiting for us behind the wall. We were to go by the Communist road and through the trap-door. Seeing my pistols, the little Vicomte asked me if we were going to fight a duel. I said, "Yes, what a duel." But of course I had no time to explain things to him. The Vicomte is a brave little fellow, but he knew hardly anything about his adversary, and that was all the better. My great fear was lest he was already somewhere near us, preparing the Punjab lasso. No one knows better than No one knows better than he how to throw the Punjab lasso, for he is the king of stranglers even as he is the prince of conjurers. When he had finished making the little sultana laugh at the time of the rosy hours of Mazandaran, she herself used to ask him to amuse her by giving her a thrill. It was then that he introduced the sport of the Punjab lasso. He had lived in India and required an incredible skill in the art of strangulation. He would make them lock him into a courtyard, to which they brought a warrior, usually a man condemned to death, armed with a long pike and a big sword. Eric had only his lasso, and it was always just when the warrior thought he was going to fell Eric with a tremendous blow that he heard the lasso whip through the air. With a turn of the wrist, Eric tightened in the noose round his adversary's neck and, in this fashion, dragged him before the little sultana and her woman, who sat looking from a window and applauding. The little sultana herself learnt to wield the Punjab lasso, and killed several of her women, and even one of the ladies who came to call. But I prefer to drop this terrible subject of the rosy hours of Mazandaran. I have mentioned it only to explain why, on arriving with the Vicomte de Chagny in the cellars of the opera, I felt bound to protect my companion against the ever-threatening danger of death by strangling. My pistols could serve no purpose, for Eric was not likely to show himself, but Eric could always strangle us. I had no time to explain all this to the Vicomte. Besides, there was nothing to be gained by complicating the position. I simply told Monsieur de Chagny to keep his hand at the level of his eyes, with the arm bent, as though waiting for the command to fire. With his victim in this attitude, it is impossible, even for the most expert strangler, to throw the lasso with advantage. It catches you not only round the neck, but also round the arm or hand. This enables you easily to unloose the lasso, which then becomes harmless. After avoiding the commissary of police, a number of door shutters, and the firemen, after meeting the rat-catcher and passing the man in the felt hat unperceived, the Vicomte and I arrived without obstacle in the third cellar, between the set-piece and the scene from the Roi de Lahore. I worked the stone, and we jumped into the house which Eric had built himself in the double case of the foundation wall of the opera. And this was the easiest thing in the world for him to do, because Eric was one of the chief contractors under Philippe Garnier, the architect of the opera, and continued to work mysteriously all by himself when the works were officially suspended during the war, the siege of Paris, and the Commune. I knew my Eric too well to feel at all comfortable when I jumped into his house. I knew that he had made a certain palace at Mazandaran. From being the most honest building conceivable, he soon turned it into a house of the very devil, where you could not utter a word, but it was overheard or repeated by an echo. With his trapdoors, the monster was responsible for endless tragedies of all kinds. He hit upon astonishing inventions. Of these, the most curious, horrible, and dangerous was the so-called torture chamber. Except in special cases, when the little sultana amused herself by inflicting suffering upon some unoffending citizen, no one was let into it but wretches condemned to death. And even then, when these had had enough, they were always at liberty to put an end to themselves with a Punjab lasso or bowstring, left to their use at the foot of an iron tree. My alarm, therefore, was great when I saw the room into which Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny and I had dropped was an exact copy of the torture chamber of the rosy hours of Mazandaran. At our feet, I found the Punjab lasso, which I had been dreading all the evening. I was convinced that this rope had already done duty for Joseph Bouquet, who, like myself, must have caught Eric one evening, working the stone in the third cellar. He probably tried it in his turn, fell into the torture chamber, and only left it hanged. I could well imagine Eric dragging the body in order to get rid of it to the scene from the Roi de Lahore. I don't know why that's always difficult for me to say. And hanging it there as an example, or to increase the superstitious terror that was to help him in guarding the approaches to his lair. Then, upon reflection, Eric went back to fetch the Punjab lasso, which is very curiously made out of catgut, and which might have set an examining magistrate thinking. This explains the disappearance of the rope. And now I discovered the lasso at our feet in the torture chamber. I am no coward, but cold sweat covered my forehead as I moved the little red disk of my lantern over the walls. Monsieur de Chagny noticed it and asked, "What is the matter, sir?" I made him a violent sign to be silent. End of chapter. I'm just taking a drink. Chapter 22. In the Torture Chamber. The Persian's narrative continued. We were in the middle of a small 6-cornered room, the sides of which were covered with mirrors from floor to ceiling. In the corner we could clearly see the joins in the glasses and the little segments intended to turn on their drums. Yes, I recognized them, and I recognized the iron tree in the corner fixed in one of those segments, the iron tree with its iron branch for the hanged man. I seized my companion's arm. The Vicomte de Chagny was all a-quiver, eager to shout to his betrothed that he was bringing her help. I feared that he would not be able to contain himself. Suddenly, we heard noises on our left. It sounded at first like a door opening and shutting in the next room, and then came a dull moan. I clutched Monsieur de Chagny's arm more firmly still, and then we distinctly heard the words, "You must make your choice, the wedding mass or the requiem mass." I recognized the voice of the monster. There was another moan, followed by a long silence. I was persuaded by now that the monster was unaware of our presence in this house, for otherwise he would certainly have managed not to let us hear him. He would only have had to close the little invisible window through which the torture lovers looked down into the torture chamber. Besides, I was certain that if he had known of our presence, the tortures would have begun at once. The important thing was not to let him know, and I dreaded nothing so much as the impulsiveness of the Vicomte de Chagny, who wanted to rush through the walls to Christine Daae, whose moans, as we thought, we continued to hear at intervals. "The requiem mass is not at all gay," Eric's voice resumed, "whereas the wedding mass, you can take my word for it, is magnificent. One must take a resolution in no one's mind. I can't go on living like this, like a mole in a burrow. Don White triumphant is finished, and now I want to live like everybody else. I want to have a wife like everybody else and take her out on Sundays. I have invented a mask that makes me look like anybody. People will not even turn round to stare at me. You will be the happiest of women, and we will sing all by ourselves till we swoon away with delight. You are crying, you are afraid of me, and yet I am really not wicked. Love me and you shall see. All I wanted was to be loved from myself. If you loved me, I should be as gentle as a lamb, and you could do anything with me as you pleased." Soon the moans that accompanied that sort of love's litany increased and increased. I have never heard anything more despairing, and Monsieur de Chagny and I recognized that this terrible lamentation came from Eric himself. Christine seemed to stand dumb with horror, without strength to cry out, while the monster was on his knees before her. 3 times over, Eric fiercely bewailed his fate. "You don't love me! You don't love me! You don't love me!" And then more gently, "Why do you cry? You know it gives me pain to see you cry." A silence. Each silence gave us fresh hope. We said to ourselves, perhaps he has left Christine behind the wall. And then we thought only of the possibility of informing Christine Daae of our presence, unknown to the monster. We were unable to leave the torture chamber now, unless Christine opened the door to us, and it was only on this condition that we could hope to help her, for we did not even know where the door might be. Suddenly the silence in the next room was disturbed by the ringing of an electric bell. There was a sound on the other side of the wall, and Eric's voice was thunder. "Somebody ringing! Come in!" A sinister chuckle. "Who's come bothering now? Wait for me here. I am going to tell the siren to open the door." Steps moved away. A door closed. I had no time to think of the fresh horror that was preparing. I forgot that the monster was only going out, perhaps to perpetuate perpetrate a fresh crime. I understood but one thing. Christine was alone behind the wall. The Vicomte de Chagny was already calling to her, "Christine! Christine!" As we could hear what she said in the next room, there was no reason why my companion should not be heard in his turn. Nevertheless, the Vicomte had to repeat his cry time after time. At last a faint voice reached us. "I'm dreaming," it said. "Christine! Christine, it is I, Raoul!" A silence. "But answer me, Christine! In heaven's name, if you are alone, answer me!" Then Christine's voice whispered Raoul's name. "Yes, yes, it is I. It's not a dream. Christine, trust me. You are here to save me, but be prudent. When you hear the monster, warn us." Then Christine gave way to fear. She trembled lest Eric should discover where Raoul was hidden. She told us in a few hurried words that Eric had gone quite mad with love, and that he had decided to kill everybody and himself with everybody if she did not consent to become his wife. He had given her till 11 o'clock the next evening for reflection. It was the last respite. She must then choose, as he said, between the wedding mass and the requiem. And Eric had then uttered a phrase which Christine did not quite understand. "Yes or no? If your answer is no, everybody will be dead and buried." But I understood the sentence perfectly, for it corresponded with a terrible manner with my own dreadful thought. "Can you tell us where Eric is?" I asked. She replied that he must have left the house. "Could you make sure?" "No, I am fastened. I cannot stir a limb." When we heard this, Monsieur de Chagny and I gave a yell of fury. Our safety, the safety of all the three of us, depended on the girl's liberty of movement. "But where are you?" asked Christine. "There are only 2 doors in this room, the Louis-Philippe room, of which I told you, Raoul. A door through which Eric comes and goes, and another which he has never opened before me, and which he has forbidden me ever to go through, because he says it is the most dangerous of the doors, the door of the torture chamber." "Christine, that is where we are." "You are in the torture chamber?" "Yes, but we cannot see the door." "Oh, if I could only drag myself so far! I would knock at the door, and that would tell you where it is." "Is it a door with a lock to it?" I asked. "Yes, with a lock." "Mademoiselle," I exclaimed, "it is absolutely vital that you should open that door to us." "But how?" asked the poor girl tearfully. We heard her straining, trying to free herself from the bonds that held her. "I know where the key is," she said in a voice that seemed exhausted by the effort she had made. "But I am fastened so tight. Oh, the wretch!" And she gave a sob. "Where's the key?" I asked, signing to Monsieur de Chagny not to speak, and to leave the business to me, for we had not a moment to lose. "In the next room, where the organ with another little bronze key, which she also forbade me to touch. They are both in a little leather bag, which she calls the bag of life and death. Raoul, Raoul, fly! Everything is mysterious and terrible here, and Eric will soon have gone quite mad, and you are in the torture chamber. Go back by the way you came. There must be a reason why the room is called a name like that." "Christine," said the young man, "we will go from here together or die together." "We must keep cool," I whispered. "Why has he fastened you, mademoiselle? You can't escape from his house, and he knows it." "I tried to commit suicide. The monster went out last night after carrying me here fainting and half chloroformed. He was going to his banker, he said. So he returned and found me with my face covered with blood. I had tried to kill myself by striking my forehead against the wall. Christine, groaned Raoul, and he began to sob. Then he bound me. I'm not allowed to die until 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. Mademoiselle, I declared, the monster bound you, and he shall unbind you. You have only to play the necessary part. Remember that he loves you. Alas, we heard, am I likely to forget it? But Christine's, Remember it and smile on him. Entreat him. Tell him that your bonds hurt you. But Christine Daae said, "Hush! I hear something in the wall on the lake. It is he! Go away, go away, go away!" "We could not go away even if you wanted to," I said, as impressively as I could. "We cannot leave this, and we are in the torture chamber." "Hush!" whispered Christine again. Heavy steps dragged slowly behind the wall, stopped, and then made the door creak once more. Next came a tremendous sigh, followed by a cry of horror from Christine, and we heard Eric's voice. "I beg your pardon for letting you see a face like this. Oh, what a state I am in, am I not? It's the other one's fault. Why did he ring? Do I ask people who pass to tell me the time? You will never ask anybody the time again. It is the siren's fault." Hi, Umbrellan. Okay, have a good rest of your day or night, or whichever time zone it is. Thanks for hanging out for a bit. Another sigh, deeper, more tremendous still, came from the abysmal depths of a soul. "Why did you cry out, Christine?" "Because I'm in pain, Eric." "I thought I had frightened you." "Eric, unloose my bonds. Am I not your prisoner?" "You will try to kill yourself again." "You have given me till 11 o'clock tomorrow evening, Eric." The footsteps dragged along the floor once again. "After all, since we are to die together, since I am just as eager to die as you are, yes, I have had enough of this life, you know. Wait, don't move. I will release you. You have only one word to say, 'No,' and it will at once be finished with everybody. You are right. You are right. Why wait till 11 o'clock tomorrow evening? True, it would have been grander, finer, but that is childish nonsense. We should only think of ourselves in this life, of our own death. The rest doesn't matter. You're looking at me because I am all wet? Oh, my dear, it's raining cats and dogs outside. Apart from that, Christine, I believe that I am suffering from hallucinations. You know the man who rang at the siren's door just now? I wonder if he's ringing at the bottom of the lake. Well, he was rather like... Then turn around. Are you glad? You're free now. Oh, Christine, look at your poor dear wrists. Tell me, have I hurt them? That alone deserves death. Talking of death, I must sing his requiem." Hearing these terrible remarks, I received an awful presentiment. I, too, had once rung at the monster's door, and, without knowing it, must have set some warning current in motion, and I remembered the two arms that had emerged from the inky waters. That poor wretch had strayed to that shore this time. Who was the other one, the one whose requiem we now heard sung? Eric sang like the god of thunder, sang a dies irae that enveloped us in a storm. The elements seemed to rage around us. Suddenly, the organ and the voice ceased so suddenly that Monsieur de Chagny and I jumped back on the other side of the wall with a shock, and the voice, now changed and transformed, distinctly grated out these metallic symbols. "What have you done with my bag?" Chapter 23. The torture begins. The Persian's narrative continued. The voice repeated angrily, "What have you done with my bag? So it was to take my bag that you asked me to release you?" We heard hurried steps, Christine running back to the Louis-Philippe room as though to seek shelter in front of our wall. "What are you running away from?" asked the furious man who had followed her. "Give me back my bag, will you? Don't you know that it is a bag of life and death?" "Listen to me, Eric," sighed the girl. "As it is settled that we are to live together, what difference can it make to you?" "You know that there are only 2 keys in it," said the monster. "What do you want to do?" "I want to look at this room which I have never seen, and which you have always kept hidden from me." "It's woman's curiosity," she said in a tone which she tried to render playful. But the trick was too childish for Eric to be taken in by. I don't like curious women, he retorted, and you had better remember the story of Bluebeard. And be careful. Come, give me back my bag. Give me back my bag! Leave the key alone, will you, you inquisitive little thing! And he chuckled, while Christine gave a cry of pain. Eric had evidently removed the bag from her. At that moment, the Vicomte could not help uttering an exclamation of impotent rage. "Hello, what's that?" asked the monster. "Did you hear, Christine?" No, replied the poor girl. "I heard nothing." "I thought I heard a cry." "A cry? Are you going mad, Eric? Whom do you expect to give a cry in this house? I cried out because you hurt me." "I heard nothing." "I don't like the way you said that. You're trembling. You're quite excited." "You're lying." "There was a cry. There was a cry." "There was someone in the torture chamber." "Ah, I understand now." "There is no one here, Eric." "I understand." "No one!" "The man you want to marry, perhaps." "I don't want to marry anybody. You know I don't." Another nasty chuckle. "Well, it won't take long to find out, Christine, my love. We need not open the chamber. The door to see what is happening. Oh, sorry. Christine, my love, we do not need to open the door to see what is happening in the torture chamber. Would you like to see? Would you like to see? Come here. Oh, if there is really someone there, you will see the invisible window light up at the top of the wall near the ceiling. We have only to draw back the black curtain and put out the light there. There it is. Let's put out the light. You're not afraid of the dark when you're with your little husband." Then we heard Christine's voice of anguish. "No, I'm frightened. I tell you, I'm afraid of the dark. I don't care about that room now. You're always frightening me, like a child with your torture chamber. And so I became inquisitive, but I don't care about it now, not a bit, not a bit." And that which I feared above all other things began. Automatically. We were suddenly flooded with light. Yes, on our side of the wall everything seemed aglow. The Vicomte de Chagny was so much taken by surprise that he staggered where he stood, and the angry voice roared, "I told you there was someone! Do you see the window now? The lighted window right up there? The man behind the wall can't see it, but you shall go up the folding steps. That is what they are there for. You have often asked me to tell you, and now you know." "They are there to give a peep into the torture chamber, you inquisitive little thing." "What do you mean by a torture chamber? Who's being tortured?" Eric, see, you were only trying to frighten me." "Say it if you love me, Eric. There are no tortures, are there?" "Go and take a look through the little window, dear." I do not know if the Vicomte heard the girl's swooning voice, for he was too much absorbed by the astounding spectacle that now appeared before his distracted gaze. As for me, I had seen that sight too often through the little window at the time of the rosy hours of Mazanderan, and I cared only for what was being said next door, seeking for a hint how to act, what resolution to take. "Go and peep through the little window. Tell me what he looks like." We heard the steps being dragged against the wall. "Up to you." Up with you." "No?" "Then I will go up by myself." "Oh, very well, I will go up. Let me go up." "Oh, my darling, my darling, how sweet of you. How nice of you to save me the exertions at my age. Tell me what he looks like." At that moment we distinctly heard these words above our heads. "There is no one there, dear." "No one? Are you sure there is no one?" "Why, of course not. No one." "Well, that's all right. What's the matter, Christine? You're not going to faint, are you, considering there is no one there? Here, come down. That's it. Pull yourself together, as there is no one there. But how do you like the landscape?" "Oh, very much." "There, that's right. You're much better now, are you not?" "That's right, you're much better. No emotions. And what a funny house, isn't it, with landscapes like that inside it? Yes, it's like the Musée Grévin. But I say, Eric, there are no tortures in there. What a fright you gave me! Why, considering there is no one there. Did you design that room? It's very handsome, you know. You're a great artist, Eric. Yes, a great artist in my own life, in my own line. But tell me, Eric, why did you call that room the torture chamber? Oh, it's very simple. First of all, what did you see? I saw a forest. And what is in a forest? Trees. And what is in a tree? Birds. Did you see any birds? No, I did not see any birds. Well, what did you see? Think. You saw branches. And what is in a branch? Asked the terrible voice. There's a gibbet. That is why I call the forest the torture chamber. Of course, it's only a way of talking. It's all a joke, you know. I never express myself like other people. I never do anything like other people, but I'm getting very tired of it. I'm sick and tired of having a forest and a torture chamber in my house and of living like a mountebank in a house with a false bottom. I'm tired of it. I want a nice, quiet flat with ordinary doors and windows and a wife inside it like everybody else. A wife whom I can love and take out on Sundays and keep amused on weekends. Oh, you would have lots of fun with me. I have more than one trick in my bag, without counting card tricks. I say, here, shall I show you a few card tricks? It will help us pass the time while waiting for 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. My dear little Christine, are you listening to me? Tell me you love me. No, don't love me. No, but no matter, you will. Once you could not look at my mask because you knew what was behind, and now you don't mind looking at it and you forget what is behind. One can get used to everything, if one wishes. Plenty of young people who did not care for each other before marriage have adored each other since. Oh, I don't know what I am talking about, but you would have lots of fun with me. For instance, I am the greatest ventriloquist that ever lived. I am the finest ventriloquist in the world. You're laughing. Perhaps you don't believe me. Listen. The wretch, who really was the finest ventriloquist in the world, was only trying to divert the child's attention from the torture chamber, but it was a stupid scheme, for Christine thought of nothing but us. She repeatedly besought him in gentlest tones, which she could assume. Put out the light in the little window. Eric, do put out the light in the little window. For she saw that this light, which appeared so suddenly, and of which the monster had spoken in so threatening a voice, must mean something terrible. One thing must have pacified her for a moment, and that was seeing the two of us behind the wall in the midst of that dazzling light, alive and well. But she would certainly have felt much easier if the light had been put out. Meantime, the other had already begun to play the ventriloquist. He said, Here, I raise my mask a little. Oh, only a little. You see my lips, such lips as I have. They're not moving. My mouth is closed. Such mouth as I have, and yet you hear my voice. Where will you have it? In your left ear? In your right ear? In the table? In those little ebony boxes on the mantelpiece? Listen, dear, it's in the little box on the right of the mantelpiece. What does it say? Shall I turn the scorpion? And now? Crack. What does it say in the little box on the left? Shall I turn the grasshopper? And now? Crack. Here it is in the little leather bag. What does it say? I am the little bag of life and death. And now? Crack. It is in Carlotta's throat, in Carlotta's golden throat, in Carlotta's crystal throat as I live. What does it say? It says, It is I, Mr. Toad. It's I singing. I feel without alarm. With this melody unwind me. And now, crack. It is on a chair in the ghost's box, and it says, Madame Carlotta is singing tonight to bring the chandelier down. And now, crack. Aha! Where is Eric's voice now? Listen, Christine, darling, listen. It is behind the door of the torture chamber. Listen! It's myself in the torture chamber, and what do I say? I say, woe to them that have a nose, a real nose, and come to look round the torture chamber. Ha 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 ha! Oh, the ventriloquist's terrible voice. It was everywhere, everywhere. It passed through the little invisible window, through the walls. It ran around us, between us. Eric was there, speaking to us. We made a movement as though to fling ourselves upon him, but already swifter, more fleeting than the voice of the echoes. Eric's voice had leapt back behind the wall. Soon we were able to hear nothing more at all, for this is what happened. Eric, Eric, said Christine's voice. You tire me with your voice. Don't go on, Eric. It is very hot in here. Oh, yes, replied Eric's voice. The heat is unbearable. But what does this mean? The wall is quite hot. The wall is burning. I tell you, Christine, dear, it is because of the forest next door. Well, what has that to do with it, the forest? Why, didn't you see that it was an African forest? And the monster laughed so loudly and hideously that we could no longer distinguish Christine's beseeching cries. The Vicomte de Chagny shouted and banged against the wall like a madman. I could not restrain him, but we heard nothing except the monster's laughter, and the monster himself can have heard nothing else. And then there was the sound of the body falling on the floor and being dragged along, and a door slammed. And then nothing. Nothing more around us save the scorching silence of the tropics, in the heart of an equatorial forest. Chapter 24. Barrels, Barrels. The Persian's narrative continues. I have said that the room in which Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny and I were imprisoned was a regular hexagon, lined throughout with mirrors. Plenty of these rooms have been seen since, mainly at exhibitions. They are called Palaces of Illusion, or some such name, but the invention belongs entirely to Eric, who built the first room of its kind under my eyes at the time of the rosy hours of Mazanderan. A decorative object, such as a column, for instance, was placed in one of the corners, and immediately produced a hall of 1,000 columns, for, thanks to the mirrors, the real room was multiplied by 6 hexagonal rooms, each of which in its turn was multiplied indefinitely. But the little sultana soon tired of this childish illusion, whereupon Eric altered his invention into a torture chamber. For the architectural motive placed in one corner, he substituted an iron tree. This tree, with its painted leaves, was absolutely true to life, and was made of iron, so as to resist all the attack of the patient imprisoned in the torture chamber. We shall see how the scene thus obtained was twice altered into 2 successive other scenes, produced instantaneously by means of the automatic rotation of the drums or rollers in the corners. These were divided into 3 sections, fitting into the angles of the mirrors, and each supporting a decorative scheme that came into sight as the roller revolved upon its axis. The walls of this strange room gave the patient nothing to lay hold of, because apart from the solid decorative object, they were simply furnished with mirrors thick enough to withstand any onslaught of the victim who was flung into the chamber empty-handed and barefoot. There was no furniture. The ceiling was capable of being lit up. An ingenious system of electrical heating, which has since been imitated, allowed the temperature of the walls and room to be increased at will. I am reciting all these details of a perfectly straightforward invention, giving, with the aid of the few painted branches, the supernatural illusion of an equatorial forest blazing under the tropical sun, so that no one may doubt the present balance of my brain, or feel entitled to say that I am mad or lying, or that I take him for a fool. It is only natural that at the time when the Persian was writing he should take so many precautions against any spirit of incredulity on the part of those who are likely to read this narrative. Nowadays, when we have all seen this sort of room, his precautions would be superfluous. I now return to the facts where I left them. When the ceiling lit up and the forest became visible around us, the Vicomte's stupefaction was immense. That impenetrable forest, with its innumerable trunks and branches, threw him into a terrible state of consternation. He passed his hands over his forehead as though to drive away a dream. His eyes blinked, and for a moment he forgot to listen. I have already said that the sight of the forest did not surprise me at all, and therefore I listened for both of us to what was happening next door. Lastly, my attention was especially attracted not so much to the scene as to the mirrors that produced it. These mirrors were broken in parts. Yes, they were marked and scratched. They had been starred in spite of their solidity, and this proved to me that the torture chamber in which we now were had already served a purpose. Yes, some wretch whose feet were not bare like those of the victims of the rosy hours of Mazanderan had certainly fallen into its mortal illusion, and, mad with rage, had kicked against those mirrors which, nevertheless, continued to reflect his agony. And the branch of the tree on which he had put an end to his own suffering was arranged in such a way that, before dying, he had seen for his last consolation 1,000 men writhing in his company. Yes, Joseph Bouquet had been through all this. Were we to die as he had done? I did not think so, for I knew that we had a few hours before us, and that I could employ them to better purpose than Joseph Bouquet was able to do. After all, I was thoroughly acquainted with most of Eric's tricks, and now or never was the time to turn my knowledge to account. To begin with, I abandoned any ideas of returning to the passage which had brought us to that accursed chamber. I did not trouble about the possibility of working the inside stone that closed the passage, and this was the simple reason that to do so was out of the question. We had dropped from too great a height into the torture chamber. There was no furniture to help us reach the passage, not even the branch of the iron tree, not even each other's shoulders were to any avail. There was only one possible outlet, that opening into the Louis-Philippe room in which Eric and Christine Daae were. But though his outlet looked like just an ordinary door on their side, it was absolutely invisible to us. We must therefore try to open it without even knowing where it was. When I was quite sure that there was no hope for us from Christine Daae's side, when I had heard the monster dragging the poor girl from the Louis-Philippe room, lest she should interfere with our tortures, I resolved to set to work without delay. But I had first to call Monsieur de Chagny, who was already walking about like a madman, uttering incoherent cries. The snatches of conversation which he had caught between Christine and the monster had contributed not a little to drive him beside himself. Add to that the shock of the magic forest and the scorching heat which was beginning to make the perspiration stream down his temples, and you will have no difficulty in understanding his state of mind. He shouted Christine's name, brandished his pistol, knocked his forehead against the glass in his endeavors to rush down the glades of the elusive forest. In short, the torture was beginning to work its spell upon the brain unprepared for it. I did my best to induce the poor Vicomte to listen to reason. I made him touch the mirrors and the iron tree and the branches and explain to him, by optical laws, all the luminous imagery by which we were surrounded, and of which we need not allow ourselves to be the victims, like ordinary ignorant people. We are in a little room. That is what you must keep saying to yourself, and we shall leave the room as soon as we have found the door. And I promised him that if he let me act without disturbing me by shouting and walking up and down, I would discover the trick of the door in less than an hour's time. Then he lay flat on the floor as one does in a wood, and declared that he would wait until I found the door of the forest, as there was nothing better to do. And he added that from where he was, the view was splendid. The torture was working, in spite of all that I had said. Myself forgetting the forest, I tackled a glass panel and began to finger it in every direction, hunting for the spot which I must press in order to turn the door in accordance with Eric's system of pivots. This spot might be a mere speck on the glass, a speck no larger than a pea under which the spring lay hidden. I hunted and hunted. I felt as high as my hands could reach. Eric was about the same height as myself, and I considered that he would not have placed the spring higher than suited his stature. While groping over the successive panels with the greatest care, I endeavored not to lose a minute, for I was feeling more and more overcome with the heat, and we were literally roasting in that blazing forest. I had been working like this for half an hour, and had finished 3 panels, when, as ill luck would have it, I turned round on hearing a muttered exclamation from the Vicomte. "I'm stifling," he said. "All these mirrors are sending out an infernal heat. Do you think you will find that spring soon? If you are much longer about it, we shall be roasted alive." I was not sorry to hear him talk like this. He had not said a word of the forest, and I hoped that my companion's reason would hold out for some time longer against the torture. But he added, "What consoles me is that the monster has given Christine until 11 tomorrow. If we can't get out of here and go to her assistance, at least we shall be dead before her. Then Eric's mass will serve for all of us." And he gulped down a breath of hot air that nearly made him faint. As I had not the same desperate reasons as Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny for accepting death, I returned to my panel, after giving him a word of encouragement, but I had made the mistake of taking a few steps while speaking, and in the tangle of the elusive forest, I was no longer able to make sure of the panel. I had to begin all over again, at random, feeling, fumbling, groping. Now the fever had laid hold of me in my turn, for I found nothing, absolutely nothing. In the next room all was silence. We were utterly lost in the forest, without an outlet, a compass, a guide, or anything. Oh, I knew what awaited us if nobody came to our aid, or if I did not find the spring. But look as I might, I found nothing but branches, beautiful branches that stood straight up before me, or spread gracefully over my head. But they gave no shade, and this was natural enough, as we were in an equatorial forest, with the sun right above our heads, an African forest. Monsieur de Chagny and I had repeatedly taken off our coats and put them on again, finding at one time that they made us all still hotter, and at another that they protected us against the heat. I continued to offer the moral resistance, but Monsieur de Chagny seemed to me quite gone. He pretended that he had been walking in the forest for 3 days and nights without stopping, looking for Christine Daae. From time to time, he thought he saw her behind the trunk of a tree, or gliding between the branches, and he called to her with words of supplication that brought the tears to my eyes. And then, at last, "Oh, how thirsty I am," he cried in delirious accents. I, too, was thirsty. My throat was on fire, and yet, squatting on the floor, I went on hunting for the spring of the invisible door, especially as it was dangerous to remain in the forest as evening drew nigh. Already the shades of night were beginning to surround us.
It was happening very quickly. Night falls quickly in the tropical countries, suddenly with hardly any twilight. Now night in the forest of the equator is always dangerous, particularly when, like ourselves, one has not the materials for a fire to keep off the beasts of prey. I did indeed try for a moment to break off the branches which I would have lit with my dark lantern, but I knocked against the mirrors also, and remembered in time that we had only images of branches to do with. The heat did not disappear with the daylight. On the contrary, it was now still hotter under the blue rays of the moon. I urged the Vicomte to hold our weapons ready to fire, and not to stray from camp, while I went on looking for my spring. Suddenly, we heard a lion roar a few yards away. "Oh," whispered the Vicomte, "he's quite close. Do you see him? There, through the trees in that thicket. If he roars again, I will fire."
And the roars were repeated louder than before, and the Vicomte fired, but I do not think that he hit the lion. Only he smashed a mirror, as I perceived the next morning at daybreak. We must have covered a good distance during the night, for we suddenly found ourselves on the edge of the desert, an immense desert of sand, stones, and rock. It was really not worth while leaving the forest to come upon the desert. Tired out, I flung myself down beside the Vicomte, for I had had enough of looking for springs which I could not find. I was quite surprised, and I said so to the Vicomte, that we had encountered no other dangerous animals during the night. Usually after the lion came the leopard and sometimes the buzz of the tsetse fly. These effects were easily obtained, and I explained to Monsieur de Chagny how Eric imitated the roar of a lion on a long tabor or timbrel, with its ass's skin at one end. Over this skin he tried to string a catgut, which was fastened at the he tied a string of catgut, which was fastened at the middle of another similar string, passing through the whole length of the tabor. Eric had only to rub this string with a glove smeared with resin, and according to the manner in which he rubbed it, he imitated to perfection the voice of the lion or the leopard, or even the buzzing of the tsetse fly. The idea that Eric was probably in the room beside us, working his trick, made me suddenly resolve to enter into a parley with him. For we must obviously give up all thought of taking him by surprise, and by this time he must be quite aware that we were the occupants of his torture chamber. I called out, "Eric! Eric!" I shouted as loud as I could across the desert, but there was no answer to my voice. All around us lay the silence and the bare immensity of that stony desert. What was to become of us in the midst of that awful solitude? We were beginning literally to die of heat, hunger, and thirst, of thirst especially. At last I saw Monsieur de Chagny raise himself on his elbow and point to a spot on the horizon. He had discovered an oasis. I too am thirsty. Yes, far in the distance was an oasis with limpid water which reflected the iron tree. Tush, it was the scene of the mirage. I recognized it at once. The worst of all the three scenes. No one had been able to fight against it. No one. I did my utmost to keep my head and not hope for water, because I knew that if a man hoped for water, the water that reflected the iron tree, and if, after hoping for water, he struck against the mirror, then there was but one thing for him to do, to hang himself on the iron tree. So I cried to Monsieur de Chagny, "It's the mirage! It's the mirage! Don't believe in the water! It's another trick of the mirrors!" Then he flatly told me to shut up, with my tricks of the mirrors, my springs, my revolving doors, and my palaces of illusion. He angrily declared that I must be either blind or mad to imagine that all that water flowing over there, among those countless splendid trees, were not real water, and the desert was real, and so was the forest, and it was no use trying to take him in. He was an old, experienced traveler. He had been all over the place. And he dragged himself along, saying, "Water, water," and his mouth was open as though he were drinking, and my mouth was open too as though I were drinking. For we not only saw the water, but we heard it. We heard it flow. We heard it ripple. Do you understand that word ripple? It is a sound which you hear with your tongue. You put your tongue out in your mouth to listen to it better. Lastly, and this was the most pitiless torture of all, we heard the rain. And it was not raining. This was an infernal device. One I knew well enough how Eric obtained it. He filled with little stones a very long and narrow box, broken up inside with wooden and metal projections. The stones, in falling, struck against these projections and rebounded from one to the other, and the result was a series of pattering sounds exactly like a rainstorm. Ah, you should have seen us putting out our tongues and dragging ourselves towards the rippling river bank. Our eyes and ears were full of water, but our tongues were hard and dry as horn. When we reached the mirror, Monsieur de Chagny licked it, and I also licked the glass. It was burning hot. Then we rolled on the floor with a hoarse cry of despair. Monsieur de Chagny put the one pistol that was still loaded to his temple, and I stared at the Punjab lasso at the foot of the iron tree. I knew why the iron tree had returned. In this third change of scene, the iron tree was waiting for me. But as I stared at the Punjab lasso, I saw a thing that made me start so violently that Monsieur de Chagny delayed his attempt at suicide. I seized him by the arm, and then I caught the pistol from him, and then I dragged myself on my knees towards what I had seen. I had discovered, near the Punjab lasso, in a groove in the floor, a black-headed nail, whose use I knew. At last I had found the spring. I felt the nail. I lifted a radiant face to Monsieur de Chagny. The black-headed nail yielded to my pressure. And then we saw not a door opening in the wall, but a cellar flap released in the floor. Cool air came up to us from the black hole below. We stooped over that square of darkness as though over a limpid well. With our chins in the cool shade, we drank it in. And we bent lower and lower over the trap door. What could there be in that cellar which opened before us? Water? Water to drink? I thrust my arm into the darkness and came upon a stone, and another stone, a staircase, a dark staircase leading into the cellar. The Vicomte wanted to fling himself down the hole, but I, fearing a new trick of the monsters, stopped him, turned on my dark lantern, and went down first. The staircase was a winding one, and led down into pitchy darkness. But oh, how deliciously cool were the darkness and the stairs! The lake could not be far away. We soon reached the bottom. Our eyes were beginning to accustom themselves to the dark, to distinguish shapes around us, circular shapes, on which I turned the light of my lantern. Barrels. We were in Eric's cellar. It was here that he must have kept his wine and perhaps his drinking water. I knew that Eric was a great lover of good wine. Ah, there was plenty to drink here. Monsieur de Chagny patted the round shapes and kept on saying, "Barrels, barrels, what a lot of barrels!" Indeed, there was quite a number of them, symmetrically arranged in 2 rows, one on either side of us. They were small barrels, and I thought that Eric must have selected them of that size to facilitate their carriage to the house on the lake. We examined them successfully to see if one of them had not a funnel, showing that it had been tapped at some time or another. But all the barrels were hermetically closed. Then, after half lifting one to make sure that it was full, we went on our knees, and with the blade of a small knife which I carried, I prepared to stave in the bunghole. At that moment, I seemed to hear, coming from very far, a sort of monotonous chant which I knew well, for I had very often heard it in the streets of Paris. Barrels, barrels, Any barrels to sell?" My hand desisted from its work. Monsieur de Chagny had also heard. He said, "That's funny. It sounds as if the barrel was singing." The song was repeated, farther away. "Barrels, barrels, any barrels to sell?" "Oh," said the Vicomte, "I swear the tune is dying away inside the barrel." We stood up and went to look around behind the barrel. "It's inside," said Monsieur de Chagny. "It's inside!" But we heard no more, and were driven to accuse the disturbed condition of our senses. And we returned to the bunghole. Monsieur de Chagny put his 2 hands together underneath it, and, with a last effort, I burst the bung. "What's this?" cried the Vicomte. "This isn't water." The Vicomte put his 2 hands close to my lantern. I stopped to look, and at the same moment flung away my lantern with such violence that it broke and went out, leaving us in utter darkness. What I had seen in Monsieur de Chagny's hands was gunpowder. Chapter 25. Which shall she turn? The Persian's narrative concluded. The discovery flung us into a state of alarm that made us forget all our past and present sufferings. We now knew what the monster meant to convey when he said to Christine Daae, "Yes or no? If your answer is no, everybody will be dead and buried." Yes, buried under the ruins of the Paris Opera House. The monster had given her until 11 o'clock in the evening. He had chosen his time well. There would be many people up there, many of the human race in the brilliant theater. What finer attendance could be expected at his funeral? He would go down to the tomb, escorted by the whitest shoulders in the world, decked with the richest jewels. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. We were all to be blown up by the middle of the performance, if Christine Daae said no. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. And what else could Christine say but no? Would she not prefer to espouse death itself rather than that living corpse? She did not know that on her acceptance or refusal depended the awful fate of many members of the human race. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening, and we dragged ourselves through the darkness, feeling our way to the stone steps, for the light in the trap-door overhead that led to the room of mirrors was now extinguished, and we repeated to ourselves, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. At last I found the staircase, but suddenly I drew myself up in the first step, for a terrible thought had come to my mind. "What is the time?" Yes, what was the time? For, after all, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening might be now, might be this very moment. Who could tell us the time? We seemed to have been imprisoned in that hell for days and days, for years, since the beginning of the world. Perhaps we should be blown up then and there. Ah, a sound! A crack! Did you hear that? There in the corner! Good heavens! Like a sound of machinery. Again! Oh, sorry about that. That was unpleasant. You know when a belch turns out to be not a belch? Sorry about that. Anyways, did you hear that? There in the corner. Good heavens! Like a sound of machinery. Again! Oh, for a light! Perhaps it's the machinery that is to blow everything up. I tell you, a cracking sound. Are you deaf? Monsieur de Chagny and I began to yell like madmen. Fear spurred us on. We rushed up the treads of the staircase, stumbling as we went, anything to escape the dark, to return to the mortal light of the room of mirrors. We found the trapdoor still open, but it was now as dark in the room of mirrors as in the cellar, which we had left. We dragged ourselves along the floor of the torture chamber, the floor between us and the powder magazine. What was the time? We shouted, we called out. Monsieur de Chagny to Christine, I to Eric. I reminded him that I had saved his life, but no answer save the echoing cry of our despair, our madness. What was the time? We argued, we tried to calculate the time which we had spent there, but we were incapable of reasoning. If only we could see the face of a watch! Mine had stopped, but Monsieur de Chagny's was still going. He told me that he had wound it up before dressing for the opera. We had not a match upon us, and yet we must know. Monsieur de Chagny broke the glass of his watch and felt the two hands. He questioned the hands of the watch with his finger-tips, going by the position of the ring of the watch. Judging by the space between the hands, he thought it might just be 11 o'clock. But perhaps it was not the 11 o'clock of which we stood in dread. Perhaps we still had 12 hours before us. Suddenly I exclaimed, "Hush!" I thought I heard footsteps in the next room. Someone tapped against the wall. Christine Daae's voice said, "Raoul! Raoul!" We now all began to talk at once. On either side of the wall, Christine sobbed. She had not felt sure that she would find Monsieur de Chagny alive. The monster had been terrible, it seemed, had done nothing but rave, waiting for her to give him the yes which she refused. And yet she had promised him that yes, if he would take her to the torture chamber, but he had obstinately declined, and had uttered hideous threats against all the members of the human race. At last, after hours and hours of that hell, he had this moment gone out, leaving her alone to reflect for the last time. Hours and hours? What is the time now? What is the time, Christine? It is 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock, all but 5 minutes. But which 11 o'clock? The 11 o'clock that is to decide life or death. He told me so before he went. He's terrible. He is quite mad. He tore off his mask and his yellow eyes shot flames. He did nothing but laugh. He said, 5 minutes. I leave you alone to spare your blushes. Here, he said, taking a key from the little bag of life and death. Here is the little bronze key that opens the 2 ebony caskets on the mantelpiece in the Louis-Philippe room. In one of the caskets you will find a scorpion, and the other a grasshopper, both very cleverly done in Japanese bronze. They will say yes or no for you. If you turn the scorpion, I shall understand. When I come back, that you have said yes. The grasshopper will mean no. And he laughed like a drunken demon. I did nothing but beg and entreat him to give me the key of the torture chamber, promising to be his wife if he granted me this request. But he told me that there was no further need for that key, and that he was going to throw it into the lake. And he again laughed like a drunken demon and left me. Oh, his last words were, "The grasshopper, mind the grasshopper." The grasshopper not only turns, it hops. It hops, and it hops jolly high. The 5 minutes had nearly elapsed, and the scorpion and the grasshopper were scratching at my brain. Nevertheless, I had sufficient lucidity left to understand that if the grasshopper returned, it would hop, and with it many members of the race. There was no doubt that the grasshopper controlled an electric current intended to blow up the powder magazine. Monsieur de Chagny, who seemed to have recovered all his strength of mind, hearing Christine's voice, explained to her, in a few hurried words, the situation in which we and all the opera were. He told her to turn the scorpion at once. There was a pause. "Christine," I cried, "where are you?" "By the scorpion." "Don't touch it!" The idea had come to me, for I knew my Eric, that the monster had perhaps deceived the girl once more. Perhaps it was the scorpion that would blow everything up. After all, why wasn't he there? The 5 minutes were long past, and he was not back. Perhaps he had taken shelter and was waiting for the explosion. Why had he not returned? He could not really expect Christine ever to consent to become his voluntary prey. Why had he not returned? "Don't touch the scorpion," I said. "Here he comes." cried Christine. I hear him! Here he is! We heard his steps approaching the Louis-Philippe room. He came up to Christine, but did not speak. Then I raised my voice. Eric! It is I! You know me! With extraordinary calmness, he at once replied, So you are not dead in there. Well then, keep quiet. I tried to speak, but he said coldly, Not a word, Daroga, or I will blow everything up. And he added, The honor rests with Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle has not touched the scorpion. How deliberately he spoke. Mademoiselle has not touched the grasshopper. With what composure! But it is not too late to do the right thing. There, I open the caskets without a key. For I am a trapdoor lover, and I open and shut what I please, and as I please. I open the little ebony caskets. Mademoiselle, look at the little dears inside. Aren't they pretty? If you turn the grasshopper, Mademoiselle, we shall all be blown up. There is enough gunpowder under our feet to blow up a whole section of Paris. If you turn the scorpion, Mademoiselle, all that powder will be soaked and drowned. Mademoiselle, to celebrate our wedding, you shall make a very handsome present to a few hundred Parisians, who are at this moment applauding a poor masterpiece of Meyerbeer's, and you shall make them a present of their lives. For with your own fair hands you shall turn the scorpion, and merrily, merrily, we will be married. A pause, and then, If in 2 minutes, Mademoiselle, you have not turned the scorpion, I shall turn the grasshopper, and the grasshopper, I tell you, hops jolly high. The terrible silence began anew. The Vicomte de Chagny, realizing that there was nothing left to do but pray, went down on his knees and prayed. As for me, my blood beat so fiercely that I had to take my heart in both my hands, lest it should burst. At last we heard Eric's voice. The 2 minutes are past. Goodbye, Mademoiselle. Hop, grasshopper! Eric! Cried Christine. Do you swear to me, monster, do you swear to me
that the scorpion is the one to turn? Yes, to hop at our wedding. Ah, you see, you said to hop. At our wedding, ingenuous child, the scorpion opens the ball. What that will do, you won't have the scorpion. Then I will turn the grasshopper. Eric, enough! I was crying out in concert with Christine. Monsieur de Chagny was still on his knees, praying. Eric, I have turned the scorpion. Oh, the second through which we passed. Waiting to find ourselves in fragments amid the roar and the ruins. Feeling something crack beneath our feet, hearing an appalling hiss through the open trap-door, a hiss like the first sound of a rocket. It came softly at first, then louder, then very loud. But it was not the hiss of fire. It was more like the hiss of water, and now it began to gurgle, a gurgling sound. Guggle, guggle, guggle. And we rushed to the trap-door. All our thirst, which had vanished when the terror came, now returned with the lapping of the water. The water rose in the cellar above the barrels, the powder barrels. Barrels, barrels, any barrels to sell? And we went down to it with parched throats. It rose to our chins, to our mouths, and we drank. We stood on the floor of the cellar, and we drank up the stairs again in the dark, and we went up the stairs again in the dark. Step by step went up with the water. The water came out of the cellar with us and spread over the floor of the room. If this went on, the whole house on the lake would be swamped. The house of the torture chamber had itself become a regular little lake in which our feet splashed. Surely there was enough water now. Eric must turn off the tap. Eric! Eric! That is water enough for the gunpowder. Turn off the tap. Turn off the scorpion. But Eric did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. It was halfway up our waists. Christine! Cried Monsieur de Chagny. Christine! The water is up to our knees! But Christine did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. No one,
No one in the next room, no one to turn the tap, no one to turn the scorpion. We were all alone in the dark, with the dark water that seized us and clasped us and froze us. Eric! Eric! Christine! Christine! By this time we had lost our foothold and were spinning round in the water, carried away by an irresistible whirl, for the water turned with us and dashed us against the dark mirrors, which thrust us back again, and our throats, raised above the whirlpool, roared aloud. Were we to die here, drowned in the torture chamber? I had never seen that, Eric. I had never seen that. Eric, at the time of the rosy hours of Mazandaran, had never shown me that through the little invisible window. Eric! Eric! I cried. I saved your life, remember? You were sentenced to death, but for me you would be dead now. Eric! We whirled around in the water like so much wreckage, but suddenly my straying hand seized the trunk of the iron tree. I called to Monsieur de Chagny, and we both clung to the branch of the iron tree, and the water rose still higher. Oh, can you remember? How much space is there between the branch of the tree and the dome-shaped ceiling? Do try to remember. After all, the water may stop. It must find its level. There, I think it is stopping. No, horrible! Swim for your life! Our arms became entangled in the effort of swimming. We choked. We struggled in the dark water. Already we could hardly breathe. The dark air above the dark water, the air which escaped, which we could hear escaping through some vent hole or other. Oh, let us turn and turn until we find the air hole and then glue our mouths to it. But I lost my strength. I tried to lay hold of the walls. Oh, how those glass walls slipped under my groping fingers. We whirled round again. We began to sink. One last effort. A last cry. Eric! Christine! Goggle, 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 in our ears. Goggle, goggle. At the bottom of the dark water, our ears went. Goggle, goggle. And before losing consciousness entirely, I seemed to hear between two gurgles. Barrels, barrels. Any barrels to sell? Chapter 26. The End of the Ghost. The previous chapter marks the conclusion of the written narrative which the Persian left behind. Notwithstanding the horrors of a situation which seemed definitely to abandon them to their deaths, Monsieur de Chagny and his companion were saved by the sublime devotion of Christine Daae. I had the rest of the story from the lips of the Daroga himself. When I went to see him, he was still living in his little flat in the Rue de Rivoli, opposite the Tuileries. He was very ill, and it took all my ardor as an historian pledged to tell the truth to persuade him to live the incredible tragedy over again for my benefit. His faithful old servant Darius showed me in. The Daroga received me at a window overlooking the gardens of the Tuileries. He still had his magnificent eyes, but his poor face looked very worn. He had shaved the whole of his head, which was usually covered with an astrakhan cap. He was dressed in a long, very plain coat, and amused himself by unconsciously twisting his thumbs around inside the sleeves, but his mind was quite clear, and he told me his story with perfect lucidity, as follows. It seems that, when he opened his eyes, the Daroga found himself lying in a bed. Monsieur de Chagny was asleep on a sofa beside the wardrobe. An angel and a devil were watching over them. After the deceptions and illusions of the torture chamber, the precision of the middle-class details in that quiet little room seemed invented for the express purpose of one more puzzling the mind of the mortal rash enough to stray into that abode of living nightmare. The wooden bedstead, the beeswaxed mahogany chairs, the chest of drawers, the brasses, the little square antimacassars, carefully placed on the backs of the chairs, the clock on the mantelpiece, and the harmless-looking ebony caskets at either end. Lastly, the what-not filled with shells, with red pincushions, with mother-of-pearl boats, and an enormous ostrich egg. The whole discreetly lighted by a shaded lamp, standing on a small round table. This collection of ugly, peaceable, reasonable furniture, at the bottom of the opera cellars, bewildered the imagination more than all the late fantastic happenings. And the figure of the masked man seemed all the more formidable in this old-fashioned, neat and trim little frame. It bent down over the Persian and still in his ear. "Are you better, Daroga? You are looking at my furniture? It is all I have left of my poor unhappy mother." Christine Daae did not say a word. She moved about noiselessly, like a sister of charity who had taken a vow of silence. She brought a cup of cordial, or of hot tea. He did not remember which. The man in the mask took it from her hands and gave it to the Persian. Monsieur de Chagny was still sleeping. Eric poured a drop of rum into the Daroga's cup and, pointing to the Vicomte, said, "He came to himself long before we knew if he was still alive, Daroga. He is quite well. He is asleep. We must not wake him." Eric left the room for a moment, and the Persian raised himself on his elbow, looking around him, and saw Christine sitting by the fireside. He spoke to her, called her, but he was still very weak and fell back on his pillow. Christine came to him and laid her hand on his forehead and went away again. And the Persian remembered that as she went she did not so much as glance at Monsieur de Chagny, who, it is true, was sleeping peacefully, and she sat down again in her chair by the chimney corner, silent as a sister of charity who had taken a vow of silence. Eric returned with some little bottles which he placed on the mantelpiece, and again in a whisper, so as not to wake Monsieur de Chagny, he said to the Persian after sitting down and feeling his pulse, "You are now saved, both of you, and so I shall take you up to the surface of the earth, to please my wife." Thereupon he rose without further explanation and disappeared once more. The Persian now looked at Christine's quiet profile under the lamp. She was reading a tiny book with gilt edges, like a religious book. There were editions of the Imitation that looked like that. The Persian still had his ears had in his ears the natural tone in which the other had said, "To please my wife." Very gently he called her again, but Christine was wrapped in her book and did not hear him. Eric returned, mixed the Daroga a draught, and advised him not to speak to his wife again, nor to anyone, because it might be very dangerous to everybody's health. Eventually the Persian fell asleep, like Monsieur de Chagny, and did not wake again until he was in his own room, nursed by his faithful Darius, who told him that on the night before he was found propped against the door of his flat, where he had been brought by the stranger who rang the bell before going away. As soon as the Daroga recovered his strength and his wits, he sent to Count Philippe's house to inquire after the Vicomte's health. The answer was that the young man had not been seen and that Count Philippe was dead. His body was found on the bank of the Opera Lake, on the Rue Scribe side. The Persian remembered the Requiem Mass, which he had heard from behind the wall of the torture chamber, and had no doubt regarding the crime and the criminal. Knowing Eric as he did, he easily reconstructed the tragedy. Thinking that his brother had run away with Christine Daae, Philippe must have dashed his pursuit of him along the Brussels road, where he knew that everything was prepared for the elopement. Failing to find the pair, he hurried back to the opera, remembering Raoul's strange confidence about his fantastic rival, and learnt that the Vicomte had made every effort to enter the cellars of the theatre, and that he had disappeared, leaving his hat in the prima donna's dressing-room beside an empty pistol case. And the Count, who no longer entertained any doubt of his brother's madness, in his turn darted into that infernal underground maze. This was enough in the Persian's eyes to explain the discovery of the Comte de Chagny's corpse on the shore of the lake, where the siren, Eric's siren, kept watch. The Persian did not hesitate. He determined to inform the police. Now the case was in the hands of an examining magistrate called Faure, an incredulous, commonplace, superficial sort of person, I write as I think, with a mind utterly unprepared to receive a confidence of this kind. Monsieur Faure took down the Daroga's deposition and proceeded to treat him as a madman. Despairing of ever obtaining a hearing, the Persian sat down to write. As the police did not want his evidence, perhaps the press would be glad of it, and he had just written the last line of the narrative which I have quoted in the preceding chapters, when Darius announced the visit of a stranger who refused his name, who would not show his face, and who declared simply that he did not intend to leave the place until he had spoken to the Daroga. The Persian at once felt who his singular visitor was, and ordered him to be shown in. The Daroga was right. It was the ghost. It was Eric. He looked extremely weak and leaned against the wall, as though afraid of falling. Taking off his hat, he revealed a forehead white as wax. The rest of the face was hidden by the mask. The Persian rose to his feet as Eric entered. "Murder of Count Philippe, what have you done with his brother and Christine Daae?" Eric staggered under the direct attack, kept silent for a moment, dragged himself to a chair, and heaved a deep sigh. Then, speaking in short phrases and gasping for breath between his words, "Daroga, don't talk to me about Count Philippe. He was dead by the time I left my house. He was dead when the siren sang. It was an accident, a very sad accident. He fell very awkwardly, but simply and naturally, into the lake." "You lie!" shouted the Persian. Eric bowed his head and said, "I have not come here to talk about Count Philippe, but to tell you that I am going to die. Where are Raoul de Chagny and Christine Daae? I am going to die. Raoul de Chagny and Christine Daae! Of love, Daroga. I am dying of love. That is how it is. I loved her so, and I love her still, Daroga. I am dying of love for her. I tell you, if you knew how beautiful she was, if she let me kiss her alive. It was the first time, Daroga, the first time I ever kissed a woman. Yes, alive. I kissed her alive, and she looked as beautiful as if she had been dead." The Persian shook Eric by the arm. "Will you tell me if she is alive or dead?" "Why do you shake me like that?" asked Eric, making an effort to speak more connectedly. "I tell you I'm going to die. Yes, I kissed her alive, but now she is dead. I tell you, I kissed her just like that on her forehead, and she did not draw back her forehead from my lips. Oh, she is a good girl. As to her being dead, I don't think so, but it has nothing to do with me. No, she is not dead, and no one shall touch a hair on her head. She is a good, honest girl, and she saved your life, Daroga, at a moment when I would not have given 2 pence for your Persian skin. After all, who cared about you? What were you there for with that little chap? You would have died as well as he. My word, how she entreated me on behalf of her little chap. But I told her that, as she had turned the scorpion, she had, through the very fact of her own free will, become engaged to me, and that she did not want 2 men engaged to her, which was true enough. As for you, you did not exist. You had ceased to exist, I tell you, and you were going to die with the other. Only mark me, Daroga, when you were yelling like the devil because of the water, Christine came to me with her beautiful blue eyes wide open and swore to me, as she hoped to be saved, that she would be my living wife. Until then, in the depths of her eyes, Daroga, I had always seen my dead wife. It was the first time I saw my living wife there. She was sincere, as she hoped to be saved. She would not kill herself. It was a bargain. Half a minute later, all the water was back in the lake, and I had a hard job with you, Daroga, for upon my honor, I thought you were done for. However, there you are. It was understood that I was to take you both up to the surface of the earth. When at last I cleared the Louis-Philippe room of you, I came back alone. What have you done with the Vicomte de Chagny? Asked the Persian, interrupting him. You see, Daroga, I couldn't carry him up like that at once. He was a hostage, but I could not keep him in the house on the lake either, because of Christine, so I locked him up comfortably. I chained him up nicely. A whiff of the Mazanderan perfume had left him as limp as a rag. And the communist dungeon, which is in the most remote and desertest part of the opera, below the 5th cellar, there where no one ever comes and no one ever hears of you. Then I went back to Christine. She was waiting for me. Eric here rose solemnly. Then he continued, but as he spoke, he was overcome by all his former emotion, and began to tremble all over like a leaf. Yes, she was waiting for me, erect and alive, a real living bride, as she hoped to be saved. And when I came forward more timid than a little child, she did not run away. No, she stayed. She waited for me. I even believed, Daroga, that she put out her forehead a little. Oh, not so much, just a little, like a living bride, and I kissed her. I, and she did not die. Oh, how good it is, Daroga, to kiss a person. You can't tell, you can't. But I, my mother, Daroga, my poor unhappy mother would never let me kiss her. She used to run away, to throw me in my mask, nor any other woman, ever, ever. Oh, you can understand, my happiness was so great. I cried, and I fell at her feet, crying, and I kissed her feet, her little feet, crying. You're crying too, Daroga. And she also cried. The angel cried. Eric sobbed aloud, and the Persian himself could not restrain his tears in the presence of that masked man who, with his shoulders shaking and his hands clutching at his chest, was moaning with pain and love by turns. Yes, Daroga, I felt her tears flow on my forehead, my forehead, mine. They were hot, they were sweet, they trickled under my mask. They mingled with the tears in my eyes. They flowed between my lips. Listen, Daroga, listen to what I did. I tore off my mask so as not to lose one of her tears. And she did not run away. And she did not die. She remained alive, weeping over me, with me. We cried together. I have tasted all the happiness the world can offer. And Eric fell into a chair, choking for breath. I'm not going to die yet. Presently I shall, but yet let me cry. Listen, Daroga, listen to this. While I was at her feet, I heard her say, poor unhappy Eric. And she took my hand. I had become no more, you know, than a poor dog ready to die for her. I mean it, Daroga. I held in my hand a ring, a plain gold ring which I had given her, which she had lost and which I had found again. A wedding ring, you know. I slipped it onto her little finger and said, I slipped it into her little hand and said, there, take it. Take it for you and him. That shall be my wedding present. A present from your poor unhappy Eric. I know you love the boy. Don't cry any more. She asked me in a very soft voice what I meant. Then I made her understand that where she was concerned, I was only a poor dog ready to die for her, and that she should marry the young man when she pleased, because she had cried with me and mingled her tears with mine. Eric's emotion was so great that he had to tell the Persian not to look at him, for he was choking and must take off his mask. The Daroga went to the window and opened it. His heart was full of pity, but he took care to keep his eyes fixed on the trees in the Tuileries gardens, lest he should see the monster's face. I went and released the young man, Eric continued, and I told him to come with me to Christine. They kissed before me in the Louis-Philippe room. Christine had my ring. I made Christine swear to come back one night when I was dead, crossing the lake from the Rue Scribe side, and bury me in the greatest secrecy with the gold ring, which she was to wear until that moment. I told her where she would find my body and what to do with it. Then Christine kissed me for the first time herself, here on the forehead. Don't look, Daroga. Here on the forehead. On my forehead. Mine. Don't look, Daroga. And they went off together. Christine had stopped crying. I alone cried. Daroga, if Christine keeps her promise, she will come back soon. Eric ceased speaking. The Persian asked him no questions. He was quite reassured as to the fate of Raoul de Chagny and Christine Daae. No one could have doubted the word of the weeping Eric that night. The monster resumed his mask and collected his strength to leave the forehead. He told him that, when he felt his end to be close at hand, he would send him, in gratitude for the kindness which the Persian had once showed him, the things which he had held dearest in the world. All Christine Daae's papers, letters which she had written to Raoul at the time of that adventure and left with Eric, together with a few objects belonging to her, such as a pair of gloves, a shoe buckle, and 2 pocket handkerchiefs. In reply to the Persian's question, Eric told him that the young people, as soon as they found themselves free, had resolved to go and look for a priest in some lonely spot where they could hide their happiness, and that, with this object in view, they had started from the northern railway station of the world. Lastly, Eric relied on the Persian, as soon as he received the promised relics and papers, to inform the young couple of his death and to advertise it in the Epoque. That was all. The Persian saw Eric to the door of his flat, and Darius helped him down to the street. The cab was waiting for him. Eric stepped in, and the Persian, who had gone back to the window, heard him say to the driver, "Go to the opera." And the cab drove off into the night. The Persian had seen the poor unhappy Eric for the last time. 3 weeks later, the Epoque published this advertisement: Eric is dead. Epilogue. I have now told the singular but veracious story of the opera ghost. As I declared on the first page of this work, it is no longer possible to deny that Eric really lived. There are now so many proofs of his existence within the reach of all that we can trace Eric's actions logically throughout the tragedy of the Chagnys. There is no need here to repeat how greatly the case excited the capital. The kidnapping of the singer, the death of the Comte de Chagny under such exceptional conditions, the disappearance of his brother, the drugging of the gas man at the opera and of his 2 assistants. What tragedies, what passion, what crimes have surrounded the ideal of Raoul and his sweet and charming Christine? What had become of that wonderful, mysterious artist of whom the world was never to hear again? She was represented as the victim of a rivalry between the 2 brothers, and nobody suspected what had really happened. Nobody realized that, as Raoul and Christine had both disappeared, they had both retired far from the world to enjoy a happiness which they would not have cared to make public after Count Philippe's unaccountable death. They took the train one day from the North Railway Station of the world. Possibly I too shall take the train of that station one day, and go and seek around thy lakes, O Norway, O silent Scandinavia, for the perhaps still living traces of Raoul and Christine, and also of Mamma Valerius, who disappeared at the same time. Possibly some day I shall hear the lonely mountains of the north echo the singing of her who knew the angel of music. Long after the case was pigeonholed by that most unintelligent magistrate, Monsieur Faure, the newspapers became desultory efforts to fathom the mysteries. One evening paper alone, a paper which made a feature of theatrical gossip, said, "We recognize the touch of the opera ghost." And even that was written ironically. The Persian alone knew the whole truth and held the main evidence, which came to him with the pious relics promised by the ghost. It fell to my lot to complete that evidence with the aid of the daroga himself. Day by day I kept him informed of the progress of my enquiries, which he himself directed. He had not been to the opera for years and years, but he had perceived the most accurate recollection of the building, and there was no better guide than he to help me discover its most secret recesses. He also told me where to gather further information, whom to ask, and he sent me to call on Monsieur Poligny at a moment when the poor man was almost on the point of drawing his last breath. I had no idea that he was so very ill, and I shall never forget the effect which my questions about the ghost produced upon him. He looked at me as if I were the devil, and answered only in a few incoherent sentences, which showed, however, and that was the main thing, the extent of the perturbation which O.G. in his time had wrought in that already very restless life, for Monsieur Poligny was what people call a man of pleasure. When I came and told the Persian of the poor results of my visit to Monsieur Poligny, the daroga gave me a faint smile and said, "Poligny never knew the full extent of what that extraordinary scoundrel of an Eric humbugged him." The Persian, by the way, spoke of Eric sometimes as a demigod and sometimes as the lowest of the low. Poligny was superstitious, and Eric knew it. Eric knew most things about the public and private affairs of the opera. When Monsieur Poligny heard a mysterious voice tell him in Box 5 of the manner in which he used to spend his time and abuse his partner's confidence, he did not wait to hear more. Thinking at first that it was a voice from heaven, he believed himself damned, and then, when the voice began to ask for money, he saw that he was being victimized by a shrewd blackmailer to whom Debienne himself had fallen a prey. Both of them, already tired of management for various reasons, resigned without trying to pry further into the personality of that curious O.G., who had added such a singular set of clauses to their lease. They bequeathed the whole mystery to their successors, and heaved a sigh of relief when they were rid of a business that had bothered them, without providing them with the least amusement. I then spoke of their two successors, and expressed my surprise that, in his Memoirs of a Manager, Monsieur Moncharmin should describe the opera ghost's behavior at such lengths in the first part of the book, and hardly mention it in the second. In reply to this, the Persian, who knew the memoirs as thoroughly as if he had written them himself, observed that I should find the explanation of the whole matter if I would just recollect the few lines which Moncharmin devotes to the ghost in the second part aforesaid. I quoted these lines, which are particularly interesting because they describe the very simple manner in which the famous incident of the 20,000 francs was closed. As for O.G., some of whose curious tricks I have related in the first part of my memoirs, I will only say that he atoned by one spontaneous fine action for all the worry which he had caused my dear friend and partner and I am bound to say myself. He felt no doubt that there were limits to a jest, especially when it is so expensive, and when the commissary of police has been informed for a few days after the disappearance of Christine Daae, when we had made an appointment in our office with Monsieur Mifroid to tell him the whole story, we found, on Richard's table, a large envelope inscribed in red ink, with O.G.'s compliments. It contained the large sum of money which he had playfully succeeded in extracting for the time being from the treasury. Richard at once declared that we must be content with that and drop the subject. I agreed with Richard. All's well that ends well. What say you, O.G.? Of course, Montreman continued to believe, especially after the money had been restored, that he had been, for a little while, the butt of Fernand Richard's sense of humor, whereas Richard, on his side, was convinced that Montreman had amused himself by inventing the whole affair of the opera ghost in order to revenge himself for a few jokes. I asked the Persian to tell me by what trick the ghost had taken 20,000 francs from Richard's pocket in spite of the safety pin. He replied that he had not gone into this little detail, but that if I really cared to make an investigation on the spot, I should certainly find the solution to the riddle in the manager's office by remembering that Eric had not been nicknamed the trapdoor lover for nothing. I promised the Persian to do so as soon as I had time, and I can tell the reader at once that the results of my investigation were perfectly satisfactory. In fact, I hardly thought that I should ever discover so many undeniable proofs of the authenticity of the feats ascribed to the ghost. The Persian's manuscript, Christine Daae's papers, the statements made to me by the police who used to work under Messieurs Richard and Montreman, by little Meg herself, the worthy Madame Giry, I am sorry to say is no more, and by Sorali, who is now living in retirement in Louveciennes, all these documents relating to the existence of the ghost, which I propose to deposit in the archives of the opera, have been checked and confirmed by a number of important discoveries of which I am justly proud. I have not been able to find the house on the lake, Eric having definitely blocked up all the secret entrances. Even so, I am convinced that it would be easy to reach it by draining the lake, as I have repeatedly requested the Ministry of Fine Arts to do. I was speaking about it to Monsieur Dujardin Beaumetz, the Undersecretary for Fine Arts, only 48 hours before the first serialized publication of this book. He was interested and gave me some hope. There is no doubt that Eric was an incomparable artist. Who knows but that the score of Don Juan Triumphant might yet be discovered in the house on the lake. On the other hand, I have discovered the secret passage of the communist, the planking of which is falling to pieces in part, and also the trap door through which Raoul and the Persian penetrated the cellars of the opera house. In the communist dungeon, I noticed numbers of initials traced on the walls by the poor wretches confined in it, and among these were an R and a C. R.C. Raoul de Chagny. The letters are there to this day. If the reader still will visit the opera one morning, and ask leave to stroll around through where he pleases, without being accompanied by a stupid guide, let him go to box 5 and knock with his stick or knuckles on the enormous column that separates this from the stage box. You will find the column sounds hollow. After that, do not be astonished by the suggestion that it was occupied by the voice of the ghost. There is room inside the column for 2 men. If you are surprised that when the various incidents occurred, no one turned round to look at the column, you must remember that it presented the appearance of solid marble, and that the voice contained in it seemed rather to come from the opposite side, for, as we have seen, the ghost was an expert ventriloquist. The column is elaborately carved and decorated with the artist's chisel, and I do not despair of one day discovering that the piece of sculpture could have raised to discovery, could be raised or lowered at will, so as to give passage to the ghost's mysterious correspondence with Mame Giry and to his generous tip. However, all these discoveries are nothing to my mind, compared with that which I was able to make in the presence of the acting manager, in the manager's office, within a couple of inches from the desk chair. It consists of a trap-door, the width of a board in the flooring, and the length of a man's forearm, and no longer. A trap-door that falls back like the lid of a box. A trap-door through which I can see a hand come and dexterously fumble at the pocket of a swallowtail coat. That is the way the 40,000 francs went. and that also is the way by which, through some trick or other, they were returned. Speaking about this to the Persian, I said, "So, we may take it, since the 40,000 francs was returned, that Eric was simply amusing himself with that amended lease of his?" "Don't you believe it," he said. "Eric wanted money, thinking himself without the pale of humanity. He was restrained by no scruples, and he employed the extraordinary gifts of dexterity and imagination which he had received by way of compensation for his extraordinary ugliness, to prey upon his fellow man. His reason for restoring the 40,000 francs of his own accord was that he no longer needed it. He had relinquished his marriage to Christine Daae. He had relinquished everything above the surface of the earth. According to the Persian's account, Eric was born in a small town not far from Rouen. He was the son of a master mason. He ran away at an early age from his father's house, where his ugliness was a subject of horror and terror to his parents. For a time he frequented the fairs, where showmen exhibited him as the living corpse. He seemed to have crossed the whole of Europe from fair to fair, and to have completed his strange education as an artist and magician at the very fountainhead of art and magic among the gypsies. A period of Eric's life remained quite obscure. He was seen at the fair of Nijni Novgorod, where he displayed himself in all his hideous glory. Displayed himself. He already sang as nobody on this earth had ever sung before. He practiced ventriloquism, and gave displays of legerdemain so extraordinary that the caravans returning to Asia talking about it during the whole length of the journey. In this way, his reputation penetrated the walls of the palace in Mazandaran, where the little sultana, the favorite of the Shah-in-Shah, was boring herself to death. A fur trader, returning to Samarkand from Nijni Novgorod, told of the marvels which he had seen performed in Eric's tent. The trader was summoned to the palace, and the Daroga of Mazandaran was told to question him. Next, the Daroga was instructed to go and find Eric. He brought him to Persia, where, for some months, Eric's will was law. He was guilty of not a few horrors, for he seemed not to know the difference between good and evil. He took part calmly in a number of political assassinations, and he turned his diabolical inventive powers against the Emir of Afghanistan, who was at war with the Persian Empire. The Shah took a liking to him. This was the time of the rosy hours of Mazandaran, of which the Daroga's narrative has given us a glimpse. Eric had very original ideas on the subject of architecture, and thought out a palace much as a conjurer contrives a trick casket. The Shah ordered him to construct an edifice of this kind. Eric did so, and the building appears to have been so ingenious that His Majesty was able to move about in it unseen, and to disappear without a possibility of the tricks being discovered. When the Shah-in-Shah found himself the possessor of this gem, he ordered Eric's yellow eyes to be put out. But he reflected that, even though blind, Eric would still be able to build another, equally remarkable house for another sovereign, and also that, as long as Eric was alive, there would be someone who knew the secret of the wonderful palace. Eric's death was therefore described upon, together with that of all the laborers who had worked under his orders. The execution of this abominable decree developed under the Daroga of Mazandaran. Eric had shown him some slight services, and procured him many a hearty laugh. He saved Eric by providing him with a means of escape, but nearly paid with his head for his generous weakness. Fortunately for the Daroga, a corpse, half devoured by the birds of prey, was found on the shore of the Caspian Sea, and was taken for Eric's body, because the Daroga's friends had dressed the remains in clothing that belonged to Eric. the daroga was left off with the loss of imperial favor, the confiscation of his property, and an order of perpetual banishment. As a distant connection to the Shah's family, however, he continued to receive a small allowance for a few hundred francs a month from the Persian treasury, and on this he came to live in Paris. As for Eric, he went to Asia Minor, and thence to Constantinople, where he entered the Sultan's employment, in explanation of the services which he was able to render a monarch haunted by perpetual terrors. I need only say that it was Eric who constructed all the famous trapdoors and secret chambers and mysterious strong-boxes which were found in Yildiz Kiosk after the last Turkish renovation. He also invented those automata dressed like the Sultan and resembling the Sultan in all aspects. See the interview with the social correspondence of the Matin with Mohammed Ali Bey on the day after the entry of the Salonika troops from Constantinople, which made people believe that the commander of the faithful was awake at one place when, in reality, he was asleep elsewhere. Of course, he had to leave the Sultan's service for the same reasons that made him fly from Persia. He knew too much. Then, tired of his adventurous, formidable, and monstrous life, he longed to be someone like everybody else. And he became a contractor like an ordinary contractor, building ordinary houses with ordinary bricks. He tendered for part of the foundation in the opera. His estimate was accepted. When he found himself in the cellars of the enormous playhouse, his artistic, fantastic wizard nature resumed the upper hand. Besides, was he not as ugly as ever? He dreamt of creating for his own use a dwelling unknown to the rest of the earth, where he could hide from men's eyes for all time. The reader knows and guesses the rest. It is all in keeping with the incredible and yet veracious story. Poor unhappy Eric. Shall we pity him? Shall we curse him? He asked only to be someone like everybody else, but he was too ugly, and he had to hide his genius or use it to play tricks with, when, with an ordinary face, he would have been one of the most distinguished of mankind. He had a heart that could have held the empire of the world, and in the end he had to content himself with a cellar. Surely we may pity the opera ghost. I have prayed over this mortal remains, that God might show him mercy notwithstanding his crimes. Yes, I am certain, quite certain, that I prayed beside his body the other day, when they took it from the spot where they were burying the phonographic records. It was Eric's skeleton. I did not recognize it by the ugliness of the head, for all men are ugly when they have been dead as long as that, but by the plain gold ring which he wore, and which Christine Daae must have slipped on his finger when she came to bury him in accordance with her promise. The skeleton is lying near the well, in the place where the angel of music first held Christine Daae fainting in his trembling arms, on the night when he carried her down to the cellars of the opera house. And now, what do they mean to do with that skeleton? Surely they will not bury it in the common grave. I say that the skeleton of the opera ghost is no ordinary skeleton, and that its proper place is in the archives of the National Academy of Music. So we have reached the end of the Phantom of the Opera. A lot more grisly than the play. So, if you are going to be around on Sunday, I am going to be doing a watch-along stream where we watch the original 1925 silent film of Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney. He did his own makeup, prosthetics, all of that stuff. He was really well known for that. And, yeah, I hope that you will join me for that. I'm just going to take a tiny break, and then I'm going to come back and do a game stream where I'll be playing some House of Da Vinci. I will let you know in chat when I'm back so you can refresh the page. But for now, goodbye.